Hey, everybody. I think we're going to get started. Thank you all so much for being here. If we haven't met yet, my name's Sarah. I'm the Interim Executive Director with Friends of the Wissahickon. Do we have anybody new here tonight that's new to the Valley Talk series? Welcome, or new to the Friends of the Wissahickon either. Welcome so much. We're so happy to have you. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about FOW. Hopefully the heaters won't be that loud the whole time. Yeah. I'm going to tell you a little bit about FOW and then we'll get started. We were founded in 1924, so we like to say we are 100 and wonderful this year. And this lecture is actually the final in a series of lectures focused on the wonders of the Wissahickon. And one of those wonders that we're focusing on tonight is our beloved forest. And our mission is to conserve the natural beauty and wildness of the Wissahickon. And so we're conserving that forest with a lot of what we do. And so how do we do that? Last year, we planted over 1,000 native species. So that's native trees and shrubs. We removed over 3 acres of invasive species. And so they aren't competing with our native habitat. And then we're also doing many miles, over 38 miles of trail improvements. And we do that to preserve the habitat. We hope to guide our millions of park visitors to stay on the trail and not trample the beautiful habitat. And we also do that to help control the water so it's not running off and destroying the habitat in both the creek and in the terrestrial landscape. So we also do all of that with your support, and I hope you'll all consider joining us if you're not already, either as members or volunteers. We couldn't do this important work without you. So let's be friends. I'd like to also thank our sponsor for tonight's talk, Univest. Univest is FOW's bank. And they're an important community partner. They are a trusted regional company with deep roots dating back to 1876, headquartered in Souderton, Pennsylvania. They offer a comprehensive range of services that includes banking, insurance, wealth management. Their offerings serve individuals, businesses, municipalities, and nonprofits like FOW across the Mid-Atlantic region. And they've built a reputation not just only as a financial partner, but as a community partner, one that invests time, resources, and expertise in helping people and businesses thrive. We're so grateful for their support and proud to have them supporting our Valley Talk series. And I'd like to welcome up Sylvia from Univest to introduce our speaker, Andrew.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Andrew is a local urban forester and ISA certified arborist who is passionate about trees, native plants, and the natural world. Through his social media platforms and his ecological restoration nonprofit, Community Canopy Project, he hopes to encourage a deeper integration of nature into the spaces where we live, work, and relax. His user-friendly content on social media platforms at Andrew_the_arborist aims to educate and inspire people to reconnect with the natural world around them. So please welcome Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. And I'm going to be talking about the trees of our beloved Wissahickon Valley Park. Yeah, I hope you enjoy and I hope you learn something new. Most of the pictures in this presentation are taken within the park. A lot of them are mine. And most of the other ones came from iNaturalist. So if you use iNaturalist, you might see your username up here. It's a great app. It's a great way to learn the plants and organisms of wherever, really. And that's how I've done a lot of my learning as well. So the Wissahickon is a really great botanical destination. For one reason or another, there are lots and lots of plants that can be found here. In addition to the native species that occurred here naturally and have been growing here for thousands of years. There are a few reasons that a lot of non-native plants or exotic plants and even invasive plants have found their way into the park. And one of those reasons is Andorra nurseries. A big part of a big section of the park used to be a tree and shrub nursery. So they would, at the time of their closure in 1961, were growing several hundred species of trees and shrubs. And when they closed in 61, a lot of those trees remained. So you can still find remnants from the old nursery. As plants do, they spread. So a lot of them have spread outside of the nursery and into the wild Wissahickon. So that's where some non-native or invasive species come from. So I'll be talking about those. And up here in the top right is a screenshot of a 1983 or an 1893 catalog from the nursery. And I was looking in this, and they had a 2-inch caliper sugar maple. So 2-inch just means the trunk was 2 inches thick. So the tree's probably 10 or 15 feet. Today, a tree that size would probably cost you $200. Can anyone have any guesses about the cost in 1893 for a 2-inch caliper sugar maple? A quarter or $2? $1.50. So over 100 times, more today. The park is also surrounded, I guess, by historically affluent neighborhoods, and a lot of exotic plants were used in landscaping around the park. So some of those have escaped into the park. And overall, all 9 naturalists, there are over 1,000 different plant species within Wissahickon Valley Park. Like I said, a lot of them native, a lot of them not. So we'll be exploring 8 trees today. I'm going to talk about 4 native trees, 2 non-native trees that aren't necessarily invasive, and then 2 invasive species that actively cause issues within the park. I'm going to be covering these topics here for most of them. I'm going to be highlighting for the native species the usefulness for wildlife or its ecological value. And for invasive species, I'm going to talk about the impact that species has and potentially how we can manage it. I also just want to give a heads up. I do apologize if I have to take a couple-minute break or if I lose my train of thought. I've been dealing with some weird health issues that occasionally result in some lightheadedness or brain fog. So I apologize for that if that happens. Okay. Oh yeah, I don't know if, let's see. I think I can do that. Okay. I'll keep my mouse right here in case. Okay. So what better tree to start off with than the tulip tree, the tulip poplar. This is one of the most common trees throughout the park. And it's those trees that grow very straight up, very vertical, can grow upwards of 120 feet tall. And this is a very common species throughout. It is a very fast growing species, and it's what's known as a pioneer species. So usually it lands in disturbed soil, say if a tree has fallen over. Tulip tree is one of the first to land in that spot and to begin growing. It grows very fast, and it's relatively weak wooded. But it's very common throughout the park. And we'll see that, so getting into the wildlife value here, it supports 20 Lepidoptera. So Lepidoptera are just butterfly and moth species. And before they turn into these showy adult butterfly and moths, they are caterpillars. And caterpillars eat the leaves of these plant species, these native plant species. And if you're familiar with the work of Doug Tallamy, you'll know that Lepidoptera are extremely important because they represent a key link in the food web between plants and higher levels of the food web, higher trophic levels. So caterpillars eat the leaves, birds and other animals eat the caterpillars, and predators eat those birds, and energy is moving through the food web. So essentially, the more wildlife, or the more Lepidoptera and insects in general that a tree, a native plant supports, generally the better it is for wildlife because it's supporting ecosystem function, it's supporting the food web. But as we'll see, 20 Lepidoptera is towards the lower end of the scale. So tulip tree is not an extremely valuable tree ecologically, but it does support these beautiful spicebush swallowtail, luna moth, and tulip tree silk moth. All of these use tulip tree, feed on the leaves as a host plant. And all of these were found in the park. These are, from iNaturalist. But when the tree flowers in the spring, you can see there it has a nice tulip flower shape. It produces a lot of nectar, which pools in the bottom of the tulip. And if you are lucky enough to come across some of these flowers, usually they flower way up high, you can actually scoop out some of that nectar, and it's really, really sweet. It's good. But that attracts a lot of bees, and even hummingbirds will visit and drink out of that nectar. And squirrels, chipmunks, and some birds eat the seeds, and the seeds are very numerous. So how to identify a tulip tree? It's one of the easiest trees in the park to identify. In the spring, you'll see those tulip-shaped flowers that I mentioned, but also the leaf shape in general is very unique. There aren't many trees that look like this or have this leaf shape in the park. It has these kind of four lobes. Sometimes they are, let's see if I can, sometimes they are indented. The sinuses are indented a little bit, and sometimes not. And sometimes this is described as looking at the face of a cat head on, where the bottom lobes are the whiskers and the top are the ears. So that can be a clue. But also, even in the winter, when the tree has no leaves or flowers, these are the seed clusters of the tulip tree, and they persist throughout the winter. So even when the tree is bare, you can look up and you'll see these seed clusters up there. And there's probably 100 or 200 seeds per each one of these clusters, and they rain down all throughout the winter and spread. But also, these trees are just giant. They grow very straight and vertical, and sometimes don't have their first branch until 60 or 70 feet up. The tallest tulip tree in the park is over 160 feet tall, and that was measured in 2019, so it's probably even taller now. But that gives you an idea of how massive these things can get. If you want to plant one of these in your landscape, I'd recommend planting it away from buildings, and if you can, plant them in clusters so the roots grow together, they shield each other from the wind a little bit, and they're less likely to break. But they are weak wooded, so I wouldn't plant one near your house. Yeah. There was a website, I have the link here. It just said somewhere along the Orange Trail. And if you look at that website, sorry, I'm not sure what happened here. If you look at that website here, this link, monumental trees, you can search for the GPS coordinates. Yeah. The next tree I wanted to talk about is the chestnut oak. It's a great species and one of the most common oaks found within the park. And you'll notice them as you start to climb up maybe to the tops of the hills. They really like the higher elevations within the park. They like the dry ridge tops where there's lots of rocks, and sometimes you're baffled by how this tree can grow out of almost sheer bedrock, it looks like. But it likes it up there. It likes the dry soils, and it produces these nice big acorns. These are the biggest acorns of any oak within the park, and they produce a good amount each year. So that's a good clue. But native oaks are, as you may know, the best tree and best native plant for wildlife in general. They support over 500 species of Lepidoptera. So that's over 500 species of caterpillars that are feeding on the leaves of native oaks throughout the growing season. So you'll be noticing lots of birds coming in and out to get food. And caterpillars are the top food item for birds. 95% of our terrestrial bird species need to raise their young with insects, and caterpillars are the top insect that they hunt. Even the birds that visit our feeders and eat seeds need to raise their young on insects. So oaks are great. I'm always encouraging folks to plant a native oak if you can, if you have the room, because you're going to be supporting a ton of wildlife. And of course, like I said, they produce acorns, which are a top wildlife food item for mammals and even birds. And we'll look at a few really cool galls on the next slide. Oaks are a host plant for a lot of species of galls, or gall-forming wasps, which is another way that it can support insects and wildlife. So the best way to identify a chestnut oak, in my opinion, is if you're looking at a mature tree, is by its thick, blocky bark. You'll notice here in the bottom left, that bark is really thick, it's blocky. There aren't really many trees with bark like this in the park. And the leaves are also, they don't really look like what one would consider a typical oak. They look more like a chestnut, which is where the name comes from, but it has lots of secondary veins here that end in rounded lobes, and they're not very deeply indented at all. So you can keep an eye out for those. And these are just a couple of gall species that this oak supports. So this is on the inside of each one of these like little bubbles or little galls is a developing wasp larva, and it'll feed off the energy from the oak. And eventually, once it gets enough energy, it'll turn into a flying adult. It'll fly. It'll break out of here and fly away. It essentially becomes more food items, or more food for birds. So it's another way that we can support wildlife. But also these insects are just really interesting beings and creatures on their own. They definitely deserve some attention. I mean, these galls are really beautiful. They're all different shapes and sizes and colors. This one's called the hedgehog gall wasp, and this is the clustered midrib gall wasp because it grows along the midrib of the leaf. If you have dry soils, acidic soils on your property, the chestnut oak is a great option, and they can live for upwards of 300 years. There's one at Morris Arboretum that's close to that age, right on the out on the limb section of the garden. So really cool species. And there are a number of other native oaks found throughout the park. I'm a huge oak fan, and northern red oak is a common one that you can find along Forbidden Drive. It grows on nice moist wooded slopes. A really interesting population of shingle oaks grows in Houston Meadow, and this is probably not naturally occurring. It may have come from the nursery and established itself there. This species is considered native to Southeast PA, but could be, maybe it is wild, but there's a nice population of shingle oak there. And scarlet oak is found uncommonly in the park on a couple upland dry sites. So those are just a couple of other oaks you can keep an eye out for. But again, oaks are terrific for wildlife. The next tree I want to talk about is the umbrella magnolia. This is a really interesting understory tree. So it grows in the shade kind of under these big trees, the tulip trees and the oaks, and it has huge leaves. It is probably the largest leaves of any tree in the park, simple leaf. And this is one that is believed to have escaped cultivation and established itself in the park. So probably from the nursery, but it does quite well. And it's native in the southeast, kind of up to south parts of some counties of southeastern Pennsylvania. It's considered native, but not to Philadelphia County. But it's a really interesting tree with huge leaves and these nice white flowers in the spring. And they mature to these interesting seed pods where these berries come out, the birds eat the berries. You can, so to identify an umbrella magnolia, it's pretty simple. It has huge leaves, like I said. These leaves are a foot and a half, sometimes 2 feet long even. And really unique fruiting structure. You'll see at this time of year, kind of these fruits are littering the ground under the tree before the leaves drop. And even the terminal bud of this tree is quite unique with this like dark colored scales and comes to a little tip. But this one supports, again, only 20 species of Lepidoptera, similar to the tulip tree. Not a very ecologically valuable tree, but a really cool understory tree that deer tend to avoid eating as well. It attracts beetles. Beetles are its main pollinator, which is interesting. Magnolias are evolved very early in the flowering tree of life, so they attract beetle pollinators. And of course, the birds eat the seeds, but it is found throughout the park, so it's a good tree that gives the park a little character that's not common in other parts in the area. And the last native tree I wanted to talk about is the eastern hemlock. And this is a tall evergreen tree. They like the really cool, moist, shady, not always, but most of the time they're found on these north-facing slopes that tend to not get a ton of direct sunlight. So they like the cool shade. You can find them growing all along Forbidden Drive. Unfortunately, what's happened with the eastern hemlock and a number of our other native tree species is that we've accidentally introduced an insect or a pest of this plant from another part of the world that really attacks this tree and will eventually stress them out and can kill them. So what's happening in the park is an infestation of what's called the hemlock woolly adelgid. It was accidentally introduced from parts of Asia, and it attaches itself. It's these little white colored things here. Attaches itself to the base of the needle and feeds off the energy from the plant, from the leaf. So eventually it causes the leaves to drop, especially if the tree is stressed out. You know, if we're in a drought or it's experiencing another stressor, it can really cause some dieback. So unfortunately, a lot of hemlocks in the park are looking a little sparse, and it's mainly because of the hemlock woolly adelgid. There's been a ton of research considering introducing predators of this pest from its native range, but of course you have to do all sorts of research to make sure that predator doesn't also attack native insects. So it takes decades sometimes to do this, but they have released a number of biocontrol insects like this to target the adelgid. But even still, you can find a good amount of mature hemlocks in the park, and you can also find even some young reproducing hemlocks, which is a good sign. The tallest known hemlock is 140 feet tall, and I believe that's also along the Orange Trail. Again, if you go to monumentaltrees.com. And you can identify a hemlock. It's evergreen, so in the winter, when all the deciduous trees have lost their leaves, you'll notice the hemlocks keep their green needles, and the needles are short. They're flat, and they kind of align themselves roughly in one plane. Like they'll either stick out mostly left on the twig or right on the twig, but they're mostly kind of flat on the twig. They are not kind of like a spruce, which is like all the way around the twig. So that can be a good clue. But also, if you see these tiny, adorable cones, these are only like an inch big. That's from a hemlock. Usually, like, you know, pine cones and spruce cones are much larger. And this one supports close to 100 species of caterpillars that feed on the needles. And it's a great tree, especially in dense hemlock stands for shelter for birds nesting. It's good protection from storms and wind. And the seeds are also are a popular item for birds to eat. And it's Pennsylvania's state tree, so we should all appreciate it for that reason. If I had a little more time, I would talk about these great native species, which are also found throughout the park and relatively common. There are 3 or 4 native species of hickory, which are incredible trees for wildlife. And there are this mockernut hickory is most commonly found near the Houston Meadow area, but throughout the park. American beech in the middle here is also a very common tree we can see throughout. It likes similar habitats to the hemlock. It likes cooler, shadier, moist sites. And unfortunately, there's a new disease called beech leaf disease that has started to spread, and within the last 1 or 2 years have reached the Wissahickon. So it's unfortunate. It's quite widespread in the Wissahickon and Philadelphia now. But this beech leaf disease was believed to have been introduced from parts of Japan. And it's actually a nematode, believed to be caused by a nematode that damages the leaf. And over the course of 5 to 7 years, even healthy, mature trees are dying. So unfortunately, you know, in 5 to 10 years, we may lose most of our beech. So fortunate, but try to enjoy them now. And then lastly, the American sycamore. These trees grow mainly in the floodplain along the Wissahickon Creek. These love a lot of water, and they can grow really rapidly. They can become really big trees. It's the trees with this white peeling bark. And there are a number of really big sycamores throughout. And now the next 2 I wanted to talk about, these are non-native trees. They're not necessarily considered invasive within the park because they haven't really spread and outcompeted native vegetation. And they're not documented to be invasive species within the United States, but they're just kind of persisting and are interesting to mention. They're relatively uncommon, and you may not know about these species. So the first one is called the tune tree, or Tuna sinensis. And this is certainly a remnant from Andorra nurseries. It can be found only in one spot in the park, and that's behind the Wissahickon Environmental Center, or the treehouse. And there are a number of mature trees back there that were planted in the nursery. A few of them are over 100 years old now. This one was 65 years old in 1979. And it was originally introduced to the US as an ornamental tree for gardens, arboreta, and also as a culinary for a culinary use. It's in its native range, it's really a popular vegetable for folks in China. You can harvest the emerging bud in the spring, and you can saute it and blanch it and use it in a number of dishes. It's described as having a beefy onion flavor, which is interesting. And if you ever, break a leaf off and smell it, that's what it smells like. It's really cool. And now this is to identify this, it looks a lot like Tree of Heaven, if you know what Tree of Heaven looks like. But this entire thing here, this is one whole leaf. So in the fall, this whole thing will fall off. It's what's known as a compound leaf or a pinnately compound leaf. So that just means the leaf is dissected into little sections, into little leaflets. So every little leaflet you see, every little section you see here is called a leaflet. And like I said, in the fall, this whole thing will fall off. But this leaf was really long. It was like 3 feet. And it looks a lot like Tree of Heaven, except it has these subtle serrations along the leaflet margins, whereas Tree of Heaven does not have those sharp serrations. It only has maybe 1 or 2 little round scent glands towards the base. But if you see these teeth and these long, big pinnate leaves, you may have found the tune trees. But also, some of them are labeled back there, so that helps. And it has an old name, but yeah. And interestingly, a lot of these trees in the Philly area are dying, a lot of the mature ones. And I think personally, I think it's because of the spotted lanternfly. This is native to where the spotted lanternfly is native, and it really feeds on this heavy. So in the growing season, if you walk around these trees, you'll see like black sooty mold from the lanternfly waste. So maybe when, a few years ago when the lanternflies were really abundant and they were hitting these trees hard, maybe that caused some stress. But the big trees are seemingly declining. But the thing with this species is that it sends up suckers from its extensive root system. So it'll just send up new stems throughout. And it's kind of resulted in this area in like a mini dense forest of tune trees. So even as these big trees are dying, it's not really an issue for the root system because they're just sending up new shoots. But yeah, that's the tune tree. This is harvesting, kind of the stage you want to harvest them for. And yeah, you can check them out kind of in the area where the Great Beach used to be. They're pretty common in some areas there. The next tree I wanted to talk about is the Chinese wingnut. And this is found in 3 locations within the park. And this one was probably an escapee from local gardens, from folks' gardens, or from local arboreta or public gardens. It's been located in 3 spots, although it's probably found in more. And it does establish itself by seed, unlike tune tree that doesn't really seed around. This can grow from seed, so we'll have to keep an eye on it, and hopefully it doesn't, start to become an invasive issue. But this was introduced to the U.S. As an ornamental species for public gardens as well. It hasn't been documented as an invasive species, but like I said, it's something to keep an eye out for. So these are the fruits of the tree. It hangs down kind of like, they look like maple seeds almost, but it's actually in the walnut family, so it's closely related to black walnuts and even hickories. And that's what the seeds look like. So these like to grow in the floodplain of the Wissahickon, so you'll find them close to water. And it has a really interesting, again, this is a compound leaf, a pinnately compound leaf. So in the fall, this whole thing will fall off. These are the leaflets. But what's interesting about the wingnut is that it has it has these little wings along the leaf stem. So if you look closely, you can see these little kind of leafy appendages along the stem of the leaf. There aren't many plants that do that. And this is one of them. So that's a great clue. Shining sumac, which is a native species, that also does this, but shining sumac isn't super common in the Wiss. So that's a great way to identify it. It has this smooth bark with vertical striations, and it has these long drooping seeds. If you see this species, definitely put it on iNaturalist if you can, because there's a project on there tracking like these non-native borderline invasive species to see if they become an issue. So if you put that on there, we can put it into that data. And yeah, the last two I'll talk about are invasive species. So these are non-native species by definition, and they spread rapidly throughout the park and cause issues. They outcompete native plants. And because these species have not evolved with our wildlife, they don't support Lepidoptera. They don't really support birds. And overall, they just support a lot less wildlife than our native species. And the issue becomes when these invasive species start spreading, they outcompete the ecologically valuable native species or prevent the native species from regenerating. And over time, if left unmanaged, they can cause serious ecosystem issues. You'll notice a decrease in biodiversity and wildlife. And one of those species is the Japanese angelica tree, also known as devil's walking stick. You may have heard that name. This is a small tree or a large shrub, and it's known for these really spiky stems and really large leaves. So I mentioned the compound leaf. Let me grab it one second. I got one here. This is one whole leaf from the Japanese angelica tree. So I mentioned compound leaves. We saw a few compound leaves. This is what's called a bipinnately compound leaf because it's twice dissected. So it has one central stem here, and then it is dissected again. This whole thing is one leaflet. So these are all leaflets. And then each individual leaf here is a sub-leaflet. So this whole thing is one leaf. When in the fall, when this falls off, you're pretty much just left with a tall, spiky stick in the ground. So it's a really interesting tree in that way. But this, interestingly, was introduced in the 1830s as an ornamental plant. And unfortunately, it spread kind of rapidly throughout the Northeast. But in its native range in Japan, it's actually considered a delicacy. It's a really valued vegetable in the spring. It's called the king of edible wild plants there. And just about when the plant is at this stage, similar to the tune tree, you can snap off that emerging bud, and you can imagine how much energy is kind of wrapped in that bud to get those big leaves. You know, all of that's in that little bud. So when you harvest that bud, you can saute it and blanch it, and it's a very valued food item in Japan. And my friend Tama is an expert forager. She is a professional forager and forages mainly invasive plants and sells them to restaurants in New York City for use. And this is one of the plants that she harvests every spring. And it's funny because she brought along, I went along with her for the last 2 years, and she brought along her father's Japanese foraging book. And it says, you know, carefully harvest just the bud. Don't damage anything else. You know, don't over harvest because these are, you know, you don't want to hurt the tree. But here where it spreads like crazy, you can pull them down and, you know, you don't have to worry about. In fact, it's probably a good idea to you know, chop them down and stuff like that. But what Tama noticed through her foraging is that she uses what she calls the decapitation method for these. So it's a way of harvesting, but also to keep these under control and to reduce their spread, which is really cool. So instead of cutting the whole tree to the ground and just, you know, letting it go, you think that might be a good idea. But this tree also suckers. So by cutting the tree to the ground, you're kind of invigorating its roots, and it sends up a whole lot of shoots, really vigorous shoots. And you come back the next year and the patch is twice the size and it's, you know, twice as dense. So, but she noticed using the decapitation method, she just cuts and leaves about 2.5, 3 feet of stem. She doesn't cut it to the ground. She cuts it 2 or 3 feet above the ground. And she noticed when she comes back the next year that the plant uses its energy in its roots to try and use that remaining stem, and it'll send off a side shoot off of that cut stem instead of sending out suckers. So it uses up a lot of energy. And then when she comes back the next year, she harvests that offshoot, and does the same thing. And then she comes back, 2 years later, and a lot of these mature angelica trees are dead or are in serious decline. And she's noticed good success with that. Of course, you could cut it to the ground and spray the stump with an herbicide too. But if you're not interested in using chemicals, you could consider the decapitation method. But its main impact is that it can do this. Is that it does this. It forms this like dense thicket sometimes that is impenetrable. It's got these big leaves. It shades out the ground, and not a lot of plants can regenerate under there. So you want to prevent it from doing that. But it also flowers quite nicely. Attracts a lot of bees, mostly honeybees, which are non-native. And then it produces, those flowers mature into these dark blue or black fruits that are eaten by birds and dispersed. So that's a little bit about the angelica tree. And the last and certainly least, in my opinion, my least favorite tree is the Norway maple. And it's arguably, in my opinion, the worst invasive tree in the park. And what makes the Norway maple such an issue is that it's super shade tolerant. So it's able to seed into mature woods, even healthy woods like oak hickory forests. It can seed into there under the shade, and it can grow and persist there and slowly creep up. And then maybe as those oaks die or fall over, you have a bunch of Norway maples in the understory ready to take off. Whereas like with tree of heaven or Polonia or other common invasive trees, they need a lot of sunlight. They can't really seed into the woods of a healthy forest and grow in the shade for many years. Norway maple is incredibly shade tolerant, more so than most of our native species. So it can persist in dense shade for a long time. And they grow really close together and dense, and it can just cause like a monoculture of Norway maples over time. Very common throughout the park, especially along Forbidden Drive. It likes moist, cool soils. And it was first brought to the US through Philadelphia by John Bartram in almost 300 years ago. I wish I could go back and tell him not to do it, but again, to identify a Norway maple, it looks very similar to our native sugar maple, except the leaves are more broad and they end in these very sharp tips. Norway maple has very sharp tips at the end of the lobe, whereas sugar maple is more rounded and their outer lobes are less broad. So sugar maple leaves are a little bit smaller and they don't have these super sharp tips. But also, if you pluck a Norway maple leaf off a tree, you'll notice that it bleeds this milky white latex from the bottom of the petiole. And that's a great way to identify it. The sugar maple won't, its liquid is clear. And also the Norway maple has seeds that hang in pairs, and they kind of look like clothes hanger. They're kind of like clothes hanger shaped, whereas the sugar maple is like a U-shaped, it droops down. So again, I mentioned it's very shade tolerant. It's capable of growing under the shade. And despite it being here for almost 300 years, it supports almost no wildlife. There are only 5 or 6 records of different Lepidoptera species eating the Norway maple leaf. You would think, because we have a lot of native maple species, maybe they'd be closely related enough where the insects that eat our native maples, like red maple and silver maple, could eat Norway maple, but that's unfortunately not the case. These species have been separated by millions of years of evolution and have very different leaf chemistries. So the best way, in my opinion, to manage them is to cut them down while they're kind of in that scraggly stage, trying to get light before they get too large, because when they do, it's obviously a lot harder to remove. So this past spring, that's exactly what we did. My nonprofit, the Community Canopy Project, teamed up with the Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers, and we targeted this spot along Forbidden Drive, kind of near the northwestern, near the entrance to Forbidden Drive. And there's this little area that used to be a quarry. They would quarry rocks out of here. And you can see all of these stems with the white paint on them is a Norway maple that has seeded in and has taken hold here. And luckily we had some great folks from Shriner Tree Care come in and generously remove those Norway maples for us for free. And then we went back and replanted with ecologically valuable native species like northern red oak, white oak, viburnums, lots of shrubs, hazelnuts, and things like that. And so we even planted some native asters, which I took this photo a couple days ago, are blooming nicely. And this is a good idea, in my opinion, because Norway maple is so pervasive throughout the park. So that is that. And yeah, that's it. I hope this was interesting, and I hope it encourages you to go out and look for some trees.
Hey everyone, we're going to open it up for question and answer, or Q&A. And so we'll take some questions from Zoom and we'll take some questions from the room. We'll start with the room. But I just want to ask that you remember to repeat the question for our participants on Zoom. And then I'll read the ones from Zoom when we're done with questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Andrew, you talked about the galls earlier.
Mhm.
Are the galls harmful to the trees?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that it was, are the galls that I showed on the oak slides, are they harmful to the tree? They are, in the sense that they take a little bit of energy away from the tree, but because these are native insects that have co-evolved with our oaks for hundreds of thousands of years, they don't affect them too much. Even like severe infestations of galls that you'll sometimes see on oak trees, it'll decrease maybe, instead of the tree growing 18 inches of new growth this year, it'll grow 16 or 14. But it's not a huge deal in the long term. And again, these galls will mature into flying insects that are items that are good for birds and just ecosystem function too. Yeah.
As we taken years, had a lot of growth and buds on it. And this past year, a lot of them seemed to be dying, but they were, and were, putting out a lot of shoots from their base. I just wondered, is there something that was eating them?
Yeah. So the question was, is there a pest or something affecting the umbrella magnolias within the park that would cause them to decline or resprout at the base? Not that I know of. I don't know of any issues. I know, well, actually, this year has been kind of an outbreak year of tulip tree scale and magnolia scale. I don't know if they have been hitting the umbrella magnolias hard, but certainly the tulip trees, a lot of the tulip trees in our area. It's a native insect, so again, it probably has outbreak years, and then next year the predators will have an outbreak year and get them back in check. So it's not much to worry about. But also, umbrella magnolia is naturally like a multi-stemmed tree, so it does occasionally send up suckers. And I think even on like healthy trees, you still see a little bit of dieback in the older stems and young, vigorous growth. Maybe that's just the way that it kind of operates, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know of anything affecting those. Yeah.
There's deer in the park. I never seen them.
Yeah. Are there deer in the park? There certainly are many deer in the park, and unfortunately that has resulted in less, especially in the shrub layer and the herbaceous layer in the park, has really impacted the native species that you can find, because deer tend to prefer to eat the native species before they'll eat the invasive shrubs. So they really hit the native species hard. The invasive shrubs kind of take a hold, and then the native shrubs eventually are lost. So unfortunately, yes, there are a ton of deer. They're overpopulated within the park and within much of southeastern Pennsylvania too. Yeah.
In the development where I live, we have what I've identified, I think, from my plant identifier as black cherry. And I wondered if that's a native, or if that, what do you know about that?
Yeah, so the question was asking about black cherry, and if it's native and if it's valuable for wildlife. Black cherry is native, and it's actually just below oaks for the amount of Lepidoptera it can support. So where oaks support over 500 species, native cherries and plums in the genus Prunus, they support close to 430 species. So they're extremely valuable for wildlife in that way. They also produce edible fruit for us and for birds too. So black cherry is actually a pretty ecologically valuable tree, although it's generally viewed as a weedy tree, not typically grown or sold in nurseries very often. And outside of restoration projects, not really planted that often. But it probably, like, if you let part of your landscape go unmown, you might get a black cherry popping up eventually, because the birds, disperse their seeds pretty widely. And you could consider letting your black cherries grow if you want to support birds and other wildlife.
Is it not recommended to be planted because it has a weak structure or something, or unattractive?
Yeah, the question was, why is it generally undesirable in the landscape? Yeah, I think around here they tend to grow kind of scraggly, like even mature ones kind of bend there. But I guess it's yeah, I don't really have a good answer for why. I mean, it tends sometimes to be infected with fungus that can cause it to decline. I guess it's just not what folks want to plant for one reason. It's not, maybe not super showy flowers, or doesn't have a good shape to it. But like I said, we use it in restoration projects sometimes, and certainly when we're clearing out an area, we leave the black cherries unless there's an overabundance of them. They can sometimes be overabundant. Then you can consider thinning them out. But yeah, I think it's a good tree overall. Yeah.
Andrew, you and I talked a little bit at the beginning, before you started, about kind of the relationship between fungi and trees, and often it's kind of emphasized like a mycorrhizal mutual beneficial relationship. But could you say maybe a little bit about like what kinds of fungi, mushrooms actually aren't good for trees?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about fungal relationships with trees, and if some can be good and some can be bad. I guess as an arborist, I'm more familiar with the bad fungi, the fungi that are parasitic, and if you see them growing on your tree, it usually means that that fungus is actively decaying living wood within the tree and decreasing its structural integrity and maybe increasing its risk of falling. There are a number of fungi that can do that, but I wish I knew a little bit more. And there are certainly fungi in general are tend to be a lot more beneficial for trees than a problem for trees. There are tons of species that help the roots get all the nutrients they need. They form relationships with the roots. The roots give them a little bit of sugar, and the fungi help extend the roots' reach to get water and nutrients. So there's a lot of really good mutual relationships there. But yeah, certainly if you see some species, you can, especially at the base of a tree, it's what's called butt rot. It can rot the butt of the tree, cause a hollow, and eventually that tree could go. But it just depends on the species too. Some are completely harmless. And also it kind of brings up the point of taking good care of your tree, especially in the landscape. What I see a lot is trees in the landscape, folks will mow over the surface roots, unintentionally, but that creates wounds in the tree where pathogenic fungi can enter. And then 5 or 10 years later, you're noticing big fungal conchs at the base of the tree. So just trying to, avoid damaging your tree, avoid running it over with the lawnmower. Maybe you can install a mulch bed around your trees in your landscape with native flowers underneath of it. Just keep the mowers off and keep the risk of damaging them, fungal infection low. Good point. Yeah, no mulch volcanoes. Keep the mulch away from the trunk. Thank you. Yeah.
Some years they're everywhere, and other years they're hardly working around all the things.
Yeah. So most oaks do what's called the question was about acorn production. In some years they're abundant, in some years they're not. Oaks do what's called masting. So in some years they have a mast year where they'll all kind of simultaneously produce a ton of acorns. And then the next year or 2 or 3 or 4, they won't produce nearly as many. And that's believed to be kind of a mechanism to keep acorn predators or consumers of acorns in check. So if you have one big year, and then squirrels and chipmunks and stuff will eat a lot of them, and they might reproduce a lot. But then the next year there won't be nearly as many. Their populations might go down and stay lower. So if they produced a ton each year, you might over time have more acorn predators to reduce the chances of oak reproduction. But I think oaks, that's one hypothesis. I don't know if they know for sure why oaks do that or how they kind of communicate with each other to sync it up, but it is interesting. But chestnut oak, which is the species I talked about, seems to produce a good amount of acorns every year. Yeah, but most of the other species do have the massed years. Stuff like that. Yeah.
When you break off the leaf and there's that milky substance, what is that substance and what the function within it? Right?
I would guess that's the sap. So it's all of the sugars that the leaf is making and all of the products of, all the sugars that it's making through photosynthesis, exiting the leaf into the stem, and maybe in the other direction, nutrients and water kind of going. So I guess I don't know what gives it its milky white appearance, but that's a good question. I'll have to try and figure out what makes it white. Yeah.
Talk about invasives and that it's so adaptable to climate. How climate resilient are the native trees?
Good question. Yeah. So how climate resilient are the native trees in the park? It depends on the species. Mount Cuba Center, if anyone is familiar with them, they recently did a climate canopy resilience study to see what trees are going to do well in the next 50 to 100 years and which trees are expected to struggle given the current projections of temperature warming and precipitation changes. A lot of trees that grow within the park are projected to be just fine, like white oak, chestnut oak is projected to be okay, but also a lot of tulip poplar is going to be fine. American sycamore is projected to do fine. They broke it into like 5 or 6 different categories. Like the top category was, should be totally fine, and the bottom was like, avoid planting, don't plant, it's not expected. I'm trying to think of some that were projected to do, like northern red oak is projected, it's on their do not plant list or consider planting, another species. Pin oak is another one. And also these have some disease issues and pest issues in our area, so that contributes to it. But I would encourage you to look up the Mount Cuba Center study on that. They have a nice list. And they also projected species that will do well in our area that may not grow here now. And a lot of them are oaks, southeastern oaks and hickories that might naturally start to move up here with climate change. Yeah.
How does the profile change over the last few generations due to things like disease and insects and stress? When I walk the trails, I sometimes wonder how different it would have looked in those areas that were forested at that time.
Yeah.
If I did my grandparents' day or my great grandparents' day, what is there then and how different is it today?
Yeah, good question. The question was about how forests may have looked a generation or 2 generations ago versus how they look now. Well, one thing is we've introduced a number of invasive pests that have nearly wiped out a number of species, including the American chestnut, which used to grow abundantly in the park. That has been pretty much all but eliminated by a fungus that we accidentally introduced. Ash trees are on there, pretty much gone from the park with the exception of some that are treated along Forbidden Drive. So there would have been more ash trees as well, more tree diversity, these species that have been affected by pests. But also the native people, the Lenape, who lived on this land, who still live on this land before us, they managed the land quite differently than we do today. They used prescribed fires and burns to keep the woodlands more open and to select for thicker barked, more ecologically valuable food producing trees like oaks, hickories, chestnuts. So by setting low intensity fires, they would kind of thin out the maples, the American beech, and the birches, things with thinner bark that also tend to be less valuable for food. So they would manage the land by setting fires. It would create more open woodlands with these species I mentioned, and would also create a rich understory of hazelnut shrubs, blueberry shrubs, food producing shrubs that they could eat, but also would attract more wildlife, which they could hunt. So what's happened in a lot of our forests in most of the eastern US is what's called mesofication, or as a result of fire suppression. Since we've stopped burning, we've kind of took fire out of the landscape in a lot of these areas. A lot of thin barked species that are shade tolerant, like beech, maples, they tend to be more abundant over time in these places instead of our oaks. So oak abundance has gone down in the Wissahickon and in much of our area. Hickory abundance has gone down, whereas American beech, red maple, black gum, sweet birch have risen. So basic, I guess, just a fundamental change to the species that are found here, due to fire, mainly to fire suppression. And then invasive species also contribute a big part of it too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, good question. The question was about the difference between American sycamores and London plane trees. The London plane tree is a hybrid species of the American sycamore and an Asian sycamore species. And they hybridize them, I think, in London for the first, that's where it was originally hybridized. That's why I guess that's where it got its name. And that has been widely planted around. It's the one of the most common trees in Philadelphia. It's really urban tolerant. You can plant it in sidewalks and it has no real issues. Whereas the sycamore is the native species that grows naturally here. They're sometimes hard to tell apart. The sycamore will grow, I think the easiest way is to look for the seed balls, the seed pods. On the straight species American sycamore, it will always be one seed ball hanging from the string, from the branches, one of those like fluffy seed balls. Whereas the London plane tree will have two seed balls usually. Sometimes it has one, but there's always some seeds on the tree with that hang in pairs. If you see that, it's not a pure American sycamore. Generally though, in the wild, like in natural areas like this, the sycamore is the one that you can find. But sometimes, like along the Schuylkill and parts of Philly, London plains have escaped like the riverbanks of the Schuylkill, and sometimes they even back cross. So they'll pollinate American sycamores, and you'll end up with a tree that's 3/4 American sycamore, 1/4 Chinese sycamore. So it can get pretty messy, I guess. But also the American sycamore tends to have a whiter bark, whereas the London plane tends to be more yellow, and it keeps this this pattern. Trying to find my mouse. It kind of has this speckled army camo pattern higher up on the tree, and lower down it looks like the bark of another tree. It gets thick, whereas London plane will keep this mottled appearance all the way down to the ground. Yeah.
I've been reading recently about the jumping worm,
Yeah.
and I wondered if that is, and I found it in my yard. So I wondered if that is affecting the trees.
Yeah. The question was about Asian jumping worms and how they may affect trees in our area. That's one I'm really worried about. I don't have a ton of experience with them yet, and hopefully it stays that way. Hopefully they don't spread. But the issue with these is that they break down the duff layer, the leaves, and the stuff that falls from the trees. They break that down very quickly, and over time it changes the soil texture and the soil chemistry, which alters the species that can grow on that site. I think it's an active area of research. What species may benefit from this type of disturbance and what species may lose out. But I've heard that it's really not good for most trees, and I'm hoping it stays away. But it's these worms that you kind of pick up or poke, and they jump around like crazy. I haven't seen too many of them, and like I said, hopefully it stays that way. Yeah.
Great talk, Andrew. I'm more curious on the forest management side of things with invasive species. How do you go about that process of flagging those trees? When is the appropriate time to actually fall them and get rid of them from the ecosystem?
Mhm.
And is there any way, I guess, this typical hope for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was about managing invasive species. When's a good time to remove them, and kind of what's the process like for that? I think any time is a good time to remove them. Really any time of the year, preferably I think during the growing season, maybe when they're like pushing up all their energy into the above ground parts. Like whereas in the winter, you know, some of that energy may be taken back into the roots, and it might have more energy to resprout with in the spring. We removed these Norway maples in the winter when the trees were dormant, so maybe not ideal, but it also just species dependent how they react to being cut down. This site, I think maybe a quarter of them just outright died. Maybe they didn't have enough energy to resprout in the spring, but most of them did resprout. But it's really easy to manage. We didn't use any chemicals. We just, you know, every like month or two, we'd go in and just chop off any of the resprouts and injure the base of the tree, and eventually it'll run out of energy. Usually, especially for shade-grown Norway maples, my experience has been that they don't have a ton of energy in their reserves, and they usually call it quits after a little bit of chopping them up. But disease management is super important in our area, especially the shrub layer. There's so many invasive shrubs that cause issues, and I think really, yeah, any time of year you want to remove those shrubs first, kind of clear out the area, and then I definitely recommend planting if you can. But even if you can't, just getting rid of the invasive shrubs can be a benefit because it can open up a lot more sunlight to the ground, which may stimulate a seed bank of native seeds that might be in there. And of course, if you are in an area where there are deer, like most of Southeast PA, you have to pretty much fence in anything you plant, which is can be expensive, and yeah, it's unfortunate. But fencing things in and establishing the site and just visiting these plants and making sure they're doing okay.
That's an easy question.
Sure.
Is there a native tree in our area that is a relative of devil's walking stick and doesn't have thorns? I vaguely remember hearing about that.
Yeah, that's a good one. Is there a relative to the devil's walking stick, to the Japanese Angelica tree that I showed? There is. There's a closely related native species. It's not really found up this far north as nearly as commonly or at all. It's called devil's walking stick is the common name for the native one. I think it's Aurelia spinosa instead of Aurelia alata, and it's much more common in the southeast. It looks virtually identical to this invasive one, except there's a slight difference in the inflorescence shape. So the shape of these flowers, the native one has one strong central stalk, whereas as you can see here with this invasive one, they have multiple stalks kind of spreading out. I don't know why we decided to bring this plant over when we have a virtually identical one just 100 miles south that we could have planted up here. But yeah, I don't think that plant is the native one is found in the park.
Thank you. How do you deal with bamboo and what is it used for?
How do we deal with bamboo and what are its uses? Well, I mentioned my friend Tama. Bamboo is another one that she loves to forage, and I forage bamboo with her a lot in the spring. Just when it's coming out of the ground, you harvest the early shoots. Unfortunately, around here, bamboo doesn't have a ton of uses. I know when Pico cuts tall bamboo stands down under the power lines, they sometimes donate them to the Philadelphia Zoo for some animals there that eat them. But in terms of supporting wildlife, they don't support much at all. virtually nothing eats the leaves. Thank goodness, bamboo very rarely flowers and spreads by seed, or else we kind of see it everywhere. It just spreads really aggressively by rhizomes. So managing it can be very hard without chemicals. But if you're okay with using chemicals, I think just cutting them down to the ground and using a bamboo an herbicide that will kill bamboo, that will usually do it. But if you're not using chemicals, you'll just have to continuously mow over these probably for years, or pay someone like $20,000 to dig up all the deep roots of bamboo. So it's a really hard one to manage. But I think anytime you're repeatedly cutting something down, you're draining it of its energy. And if you stay on top of it for long enough, it will run out of energy. So that's an option.
I see lots of tree carvings in the park, especially on beech trees. Can you speak to how carvings like this, initials, etc., do or don't affect the health of the tree?
Yeah. So how do carving your initials, or your couples, for couples with a little heart around it, how does that affect the health of the tree? It usually the carvings are deep enough to go into the cambium layer of the tree, which cuts off the flow of nutrients and water throughout up and down the tree. And it also prevents the tree from building new wood in that spot. So you'll see that the new wood grows in from the perimeter, from the edge of where it was carved. So if you carve around the circumference of a tree, and sometimes this happens when bucks rub young trees, they girdle the tree accidentally, it cuts off all flow to the top of the tree, and usually results in the tree dying above where it was cut. I guess that could happen with severely carved trees, but I don't think I've ever seen that. But yeah, it's not good. And also you're opening up wounds in the bark for pathogenic fungi to enter, which we talked about earlier. But I think most folks forget that a tree is really mostly dead. A big tree on the inside, the center of the tree is mostly dead heartwood. That's just there for structural support. The living part of the tree is really the only, the outer layer. So if you kind of carve into that, you're really can hurt the tree in the long term.
How beneficial is sassafras? Is it it is somewhat invasive?
Yeah, okay. So how beneficial is sassafras? Well, sassafras is a native species. Sorry. And it, by definition, it can't be invasive if it's a native species. I don't know off the top of my head. Sorry, I'm not sure I don't know off the top of my head how many Lepidoptera it supports, but it is, I think, probably in the, I think it's towards the lower end, probably 50 to 100 species, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's good native tree, and it spreads also by underground rhizomes, so it can sucker and form a nice little patch over time. I think sassafras is a good option to plant. It's a little picky sometimes when you plant. It doesn't really like being transplanted, so you have to plant it when it's young. And even so, it sometimes takes some time to get going. But yeah, I guess if you're in a spot where it's aggressive, where there are a ton of sassafras and maybe it's out competing, you have like an oak that's growing under it, but it's not getting any light, but you have, tons of sassafras, maybe you could consider thinning out, selecting certain trees to thin out and select for the oak, or a little bit more diversity. I think that's always a good idea. But yeah, sassafras is a good one. Produces berries too for birds. Hey.
Oh, we have to Zoom. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.